Although we are used to thinking of North and South Korea as different countries, they were one country for most of their history. Not long ago, a person from Seoul and one from Pyongyang would have considered themselves to belong to the same country, the same culture, and the same nation. All of this changed after the 38th parallel was drawn. After Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, the United States Army occupied the southern part of the Korean peninsula. Not to be outdone, the Soviet Union occupied the northern half. The Allied powers had plans for a trusteeship which would include the United States, Soviet Union, UK, France, and China until elections could be held. At that point, the winners of World War II were still committed to eventually freeing Korea as one, unified, and independent country with a democratically elected government. Tensions between the US and the USSR meant that this plan came to nothing, and the peninsula was instead divided along the 38th parallel, leaving the north in the hands of the Soviet Union and the south to the United States. This was the birth of a border that had never existed before. At this point, Korea had been unified for centuries. Most borders usually follow geographical barriers and markers. There was no natural marker between the north and south, no mountain range, no river, no historical reason to divide the peninsula, and no two distinct peoples who lived on either side. The 38th parallel was a completely arbitrary line hastily drawn so that the US would have the capital, Seoul, in its half of the peninsula. No Koreans were consulted in this decision. The 38th parallel was unique as far as frontiers go because it was completely imaginary, little more than a line on a map. When the UN chose to hold elections to appoint the first Korean president, the Soviet Union refused to acknowledge the decision. On August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea was founded. It was led by Syngman Rhee, the president elected by the UN-sanctioned elections. On September 9, 1948, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea was founded in the north under a communist regime led by Kim Il-sung. At this point, both governments claimed to be the only legitimate government of Korea. Both Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung believed that the inevitable outcome of the situation must be an invasion of the other side. Unification by force was on everyone's minds. Kim Il-sung was the first to act on this. After having consulted Stalin and Mao Zedong to ensure their support, he launched his attack. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea and cornered the south in the region around Busan. At first it seemed like the North was on the brink of victory. South Korea was saved by the UN Army, both led and mostly manned by US soldiers. General MacArthur, who led the UN forces, turned the tide of the war with the Incheon landing operation in September. The Battle of Incheon forced the Northern Army to retreat. South Korea and its allies were able to take most of the Korean peninsula. In fact, the Allied forces were able to reach up to the Yalu River. The tide of the war turned again once Mao decided that the UN forces had reached too close to the Chinese border for his comfort. The Chinese joined the war. The Allies began to withdraw from the northern part of the peninsula that they had previously claimed starting from January 4, 1951. For years, fighting continued in a stalemate without either side being able to advance. An armistice was eventually signed on July 27, 1953. The border changed only slightly. The war did not end, but the fighting did. North Korea and South Korea have been officially at war ever since. The demilitarized zone, which marks the border between the two Koreas, is now the most heavily militarized area in the world, a few kilometers of no man's land between North and South Korea, where all intruders spotted by border guards will be immediately shot and killed. The 38th parallel became a geographic border, essentially creating two new countries virtually out of thin air. But it has become more than a border between two countries. The 38th parallel divided two ideologies, two completely opposed worldviews with irreconcilable interests. The Cold War, which had started almost immediately after World War II, saw the world divided between an Eastern Bloc and a Western Bloc. The Korean peninsula found itself as the place where communism and capitalism, the US and the Soviet Union, clashed. The 38th parallel was a frontier of ideas as much as it was a frontier between countries. Because of this new frontier that befell Korea almost out of nowhere, North Korea and South Korea are now profoundly different countries. One is a totalitarian communist dictatorship, an underdeveloped country plagued by poverty and hunger. The other is a successful capitalist democracy. One is isolated and hostile, the other a fully accepted member of the international community. As time passed, Koreans stopped thinking of themselves as one nation. For many South Koreans, North Korea is a different country and its inhabitants are different people. North and South Koreans have different lifestyles, different beliefs, and they even struggle to communicate at times, although on paper they speak the same language. The Korean border, the 38th parallel, was nothing more than a line on a map, and yet it was strong enough to break a nation in two. How is that possible? While other borders are strengthened by mountains, forests, and rivers, the 38th parallel was only as strong as the people's beliefs in it. This man-made frontier defies a lot of clear-cut conceptual lines that we give for granted. It is easy to think that the line between national and international is easily defined, and yet it is very difficult to determine if the Korean War was a civil war or an international conflict. It was an ideologically driven war between people of the same nation, but foreign powers were so decisive in the war that one may argue Koreans were powerless to steer the situation. The Korean War itself is a sort of limbo, a war which never ends but isn't fought. Looking at South Korea now, one would never think it is a country at war with anyone. The Korean War also showed how easy it is for one nation to slowly transform into two new ones, begging us to ask what makes the difference between a people and another, or two opposite identities. The 38th parallel was a frontier of politics and armies, but it was also a frontier of ideas and ideologies. It divided a country, a culture, and a people into two. Its history forces us to interrogate how much the frontiers in our minds change the real world.